3 years ago, the world was introduced to Biomutant, a new and different take on an open-world RPG. But after years of waiting, the time has finally come to break down what we know and what is still shrouded in mystery. Hey there friends, it's Kodiak here, one half of the team behind Legacy Gaming, and welcome to our ultimate preview video for Experiment 101's upcoming game, Biomutant. The age of the open world game has come and gone, and while the past decade has introduced us to countless incredible adventures, it's easy enough to find people that were just tired of the same recycled ideas presented in various themes in different games. Still, there is a lot to love for the genre, and when Biomutant first burst onto the scene in 2017, it immediately drew fans' attention. As always, I want to take a 30,000-foot approach to the game at first, and then drill down on what we actually know about the various systems in the game, because truth be told, there's still a lot we don't know, but that won't stop us from attempting to shed light on the title. Biomutant is a kung fu-inspired game that combines elements of fast-paced melee combat, gun-centric ranged combat, and a morality system that looks to put a player's choice squarely at the center of the main story. At its core, Biomutant is an RPG, and players can expect to experience that right from the get-go with a unique character creation system, stat manipulation that adjusts in real time as you create your character, and skills that expand into various systems, all aimed at helping you get through the story. In the distant future, everything is on the brink of total collapse, and 6 warring tribes are fighting over the very heart of the planet, a world tree. Through your actions as a player, you can align yourself with one of the tribes to help restore the world, or bring it all crumbling down. Biomutant aims to be a different type of open world game, and while you will be killing enemies, completing quests, and hunting down loot, it all takes place in a much smaller space. The map is just 8 square kilometers, is much more densely packed, and players will notice that almost immediately, and the unique shape really helps guide a player's experience. According to Stefan Jungfist, the creative director behind the game, the world is diamond shape. It's a design chosen to add a natural sense of direction to the player's journey. You start in the bottom corner, and the game becomes more difficult once you reach the top corner of the diamond. The journey starts and ends at the corners, with a much more focused adventure in scale and scope, but that experience is expanded greatly during the majority of the game. The world is big enough that it's filled with a number of biomes, each adding a layer of challenge to the experience, while also allowing the developers to influence a player's exploration without outright restricting it. Areas like the Dead Zone require a gas mask, which will allow you to filter out deadly toxins. It's just one of the many different thematic biomes that will present players with a natural challenge for them to overcome. Things like heat, radiation, oxygen all come into play, and through progression and crafting, players will be able to overcome and explore them all. Vehicles are also a central component to the game, and while we still don't have much of an idea of how to acquire some of these fantastic modes of transportation, we have seen a few in action. Things like the wingsuit are ideas pulled straight out of games like Breath of the Wild that allow players to glide across vast expanses of the map if they get the right altitude at the start. Other, more non-traditional methods of transportation also look to just change up expectations. Things like the hot air balloon look to be a way to transport players to various biomes where then they can hop out of the vehicle and explore on foot. Even still, there are a lot of wonderful creations that really look to subvert our expectations, and after years of riding around on horses or using standard fast travel systems, using a giant mechanical hand to get around and kill enemies just seems like a lot of fun. Like any good RPG, story is at the center of Biomutant. As we've already mentioned, the world is on the brink of collapse, with 6 tribes all vying for power, centered around that world tree. Each tribe is unique in their intentions, as well as their methods of dealing with their problems. Each of the 6 factions are also masters of a certain style of Wung-Fu, the specialized martial arts that defines much of the combat in the game. Aligning yourself with one of the good tribes means it's your job to stop the World Eater bosses, of which there are 4, from corrupting the roots of the tree, as well as stopping the other tribes that are looking to destroy the world. If you align yourself with the bad tribes, well, I think you can pretty much figure out how that all plays out. The story also goes much deeper than that, as you confront questions of morality, self-worth, and unpack your complicated lineage. Your mother is actually the master of Wung-Fu, the one who taught the 6 styles to the different tribes. So throughout your adventures, you'll also be exploring concepts related to family and lineage. One of the most striking features about the game's story is that it's told entirely by a narrator who breaks down your adventures and conversations. We've seen this work wonders in smaller indie games like Bastion that perfectly timed out story beats, but for an open world game, it's definitely a step away from the norm. A David Attenborough type voice will guide your entire experience, and hopefully that creates an interesting dynamic within the game. You'll also have to deal with a primary antagonist, and while you may think it's those giant world eater bosses, it's actually that hulking character we met during the announcement trailer back in 2017. How he inserts himself into the narrative is still unknown, but there's no doubt he'll be a constant thorn in the side of players. Choices matter. 2 words developers have often said to try and convince players that morality is a flexible thing within their game. In Biomutant, your conversations and gameplay choices push you towards the light or the dark, which do have some effect on the content that you have access to and the impact of the conclusion of the story. Your choices will also open up and gate some content, and while we don't know much about that specifically, we do know that depending on your faction and morality, you'll have access to different sets of submutations which will change your gameplay, but not necessarily anything at a macro level. Conversations will reward players with a certain currency that they can spend at totems to better understand their inner self. From the game director's mouth to our video, there is still a lot of mystery surrounding this system, but it does feel like morality actually matters. The game's director has also said that the faction system within the game was inspired by Shadows of Mordor, which, as most people know, featured a nemesis system. As you're working to improve the standing of the faction you're aligned with, you'll have to claim the enemy faction's 3 outposts, kill their champion, and eventually conquer their fortress. It's not quite the same as Shadow of Mordor, but it's similar, so much so that the developers call it a Mordor Light type of system. These decisions will tie back into the ultimate outcome at the end of the game. Whether or not you choose to be good or bad doesn't outright lock you into that playstyle either, and if you want to pivot mid-game, that's something players can do. Biomutant doesn't look to restrict a player's choice, but it's still unclear just how far this morality system truly goes. If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that combat is pivotal to the success of an action RPG game. And whether it's Zelda or The Witcher 3, combat is one of those keystone features that the developers have to get right. Inspired by games like The Devil May Cry, Biomutant gives players the tools to attack enemies in multiple ways, with a huge emphasis on chaining attacks together. A little known fact about the game, there are actually classes, and those classes will determine the starting weapon and relative playstyle early on with your character. Classes like the Psy-Freak are more akin to a standard magic user, while other classes like the Commando and Deadeye focus heavily on melee and ranged combat respectively. We've seen very brief glimpses of these classes in action throughout the various trailers, but it's definitely something the team is keeping under wraps. What they're not afraid to show off is how the combat actually works, and like I said before, it's all about stringing together melee and ranged attacks, keeping enemies locked in by chaining those attacks together. There's also a natural floatiness to the combat that tips the scales slightly in the favor of the player and really helps them establish that power dynamic with standard enemies. To rebalance that dynamic, one trick the developers use is to mess with the scale of enemies, and you'll notice that a number of the transformed monsters we've seen throughout this video are actually much larger than your small avatar, and that's by design. While each enemy is a challenge you can overcome, the floaty nature of the combat gives the developers more opportunity to mess with the player's perspective by creating larger-than-life enemies. Regardless of the foe in front of you, there will be no shortage of action, and as you progress through the game, you'll even get to tap into supercharged wushu abilities that act as special attacks. As I previously mentioned, each tribe is the keeper of secrets for a certain form of Wung-Fu, so your progression will also tie into unlocking some of those abilities. On top of that, your character will mutate throughout the game, gaining access to other abilities like the Mucus Bubble, which is a good snapshot of what players can expect from this type of system. Throughout the world, contaminated pools will offer players the chance to discover new mutations, but it's hard to say if that's the only way these happen. We already know that mutations play a part in adapting to the extreme environments of the world, but to what extent this system goes, well, we just don't know. I think it's important to understand that Biomutant's combat does go well beyond fighting with conventional weapons and skills. Vehicles play a large factor in taking down certain enemies in the game. we've seen a number of vehicles used in combat, like that rideable wind-up hand, an underwater submersible, and a mech suit. These are clearly used in pivotal moments of the game, but how and when we can acquire and tap into their destructive potential, well, that's still a mystery. We know that faction reputation, taking outposts, and certain NPCs play a part in the overall vehicle system within the game, but we'll just have to wait and see how all of the pieces come together when the game is finally released. One thing we do know for certain is that Biomutant's crafting looks to take the entire system, what we know already about crafting, up to the next level. Nearly everything you find in the world can be used as a component of your gear, allowing you to create some incredible melee and ranged weapons. Items feature a rarity, elemental focus, quality, and material, and each helps amplify various combat-related stats like attack speed, armor piercing, critical chance, and for the ranged weapons, fire rate, accuracy, range, and reload speed. Players will also have to unlock and have the right skill level to wield certain items. How this progression system works, no one knows, since it's never been shown before. But as an example, we see that players will need 60 strength and the shotgun skill to be able to use weapons like the jackhammer Skrankhurf. Each item also allows for modifications like grips, stocks, scopes, and barrels, but here again, we've never seen this system in action, but it's safe to assume that this will change up the various stats on the weapon. Some weapons like the Hypro Zapper Talk also have a special ability, in this case, Split, which changes up the nature of the weapon itself. Hopefully the team leans into this idea and gives players the option to create weapons that break out of the norm. What we can clearly see is that crafting breaks down into 6 basic materials that make up some or even all of the requirements to make items within the game. I've no doubt that we'll be gathering basic components by killing enemies and scavenging the world, and we know for a fact that almost everything and anything you find can be used as part of a weapon, which should make for some truly wild creations. Armor can also be crafted in much the same way. Unfortunately, that's just not something the developers have been willing to show off ahead of launch. It's clear that Biomutant isn't willing to give up all of its secrets ahead of its May 25th launch, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I've seen enough to intrigue me, and from what we know of the systems, I think what players can expect will be enjoyable. I always get a bit nervous when developers, especially companies that don't have a long track record of creating games, is squirrely with the details, but I think enough is out there in terms of footage and information that players can start to formulate their own opinion whether or not they choose to buy the game. If you are interested in a full-blown review of the game, keep an eye out for our Biomutant Worth Your Time video. We'll be playing the game early, and our goal is to get that information to you just as soon as possible. If you are interested in picking up the game, you can pre-order it right now for the PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. We'll be going hard on the guide, so if you want that type of content in your feed when the game does go live, do me a solid and hit that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We'll have a lot of new and exciting videos for you to check out, and the best way to stay informed is by subscribing. If you've been a part of the channel for a while and you like our content and you like what we stand for here at Legacy Gaming, you can now help us out even more by becoming a member. For the cost of a cup of coffee, you're helping evolve the channel and build a better community. Check out that join button below to learn more. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.